The pneumatic doors hissed open and Megan O'Brien flinched. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just a tightening at the base of her skull, a half-second delay before her left leg carried her weight forward into the hallway of Oak Creek Memorial. The tremor had started 3 years ago in Marja. The automatic door sound matched the pressure release mechanisms in field medical tents, and her nervous system still hadn't negotiated that distinction. She locked her wrists rigid as she walked, hands forced flat against her thighs until the muscle tension translated to stillness. 6:15 in the morning. The shift hadn't started yet, but Megan arrived early to do inventory alone, counting supplies in the cardiac ICU without an audience watching for the tells. The tremor. The way she favored her left leg on mornings when the temperature dropped below 55 degrees. The faded scar at her hairline that patients sometimes asked about, and she always said the same lie, car accident, years ago. Nobody pressed. Nobody wanted to know. She kept her scrubs loose and long-sleeved even in summer, kept her hair pulled back tight like a warning, kept her eyes down in the break room until whoever was talking moved on to safer topics. The fluorescent lights buzzed their 60 Hz hum overhead, a frequency that had become her baseline for consciousness. Bleach and burnt coffee and the ghost smell of old blood beneath the antiseptic layer. She breathed it in the way other people breathed air, automatic and essential. 18 months at Oak Creek Memorial. 18 months of becoming no one. 18 months of letting Dr. Hargrove believe she was a competent but unremarkable floor nurse, competent enough not to fire, unremarkable enough not to threaten. Competent enough to handle the cases nobody else wanted. Unremarkable enough that nobody asked questions when patients kept requesting her by name. The cardiac ICU had 12 beds. 8 occupied. She moved through them with practiced invisibility, checking vitals, documenting rhythms, adjusting medication drips while the patients slept and their families hadn't arrived yet. This was her preferred time. The machine spoke a language she understood perfectly. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, core temperature. Numbers that told stories. Numbers that never lied. By 7 o'clock, the other nurses arrived. Sarah and Jennifer and 2 others whose names Megan had learned but never used, who spoke to each other in the quick shorthand of friendships that had developed over years of shared shifts. They gathered at the central station, coffee cups steaming, and when Megan approached to check the assignment board, the conversation paused. Not a dramatic pause. Just a silence that widened slightly, like a door closing gently but firmly. Sarah turned away first, her shoulder presenting itself like a small wall. "You're on beds for through 7, Sarah said without looking at her. 4's going home today. 6 is post-catheterization, needs Q2H checks. 7 you'll know about when the admit comes." Megan nodded. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. The key to existing in spaces where people didn't want you was to occupy as little air as possible. She turned and started gathering supplies for Bed 4's discharge paperwork, moving with economical precision, the kind of careful efficiency that comes from not wanting to attract attention. Jennifer was on the phone at the main desk, laughing about someone's weekend plans. The laughter stopped when Megan passed. She felt it like a pressure change, like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. They were talking about her. She knew this with the same certainty she knew how to read a 12-lead EKG. There were rumors. There were always rumors around people who didn't explain themselves. The navy tattoo visible on her wrist when her sleeves rode up, a single line of coordinates that looked like nothing but had cost her 3 hours of pain in a Portland tattoo parlor in 2008. The way she moved in emergencies like her body was remembering choreography her brain had buried. The time she'd corrected Dr. Patterson's cricothyrotomy technique without being asked, describing the approach as though she'd seen it performed 100 times before. She had. But not in a civilian hospital. At 8:30, the admit alert sounded. Code on the overhead. Not a code blue, not yet, but something that qualified as urgent. Cardiac monitor showing arrhythmia. She pulled up the information on the unit system. Colonel Bradley Vance, Air Force, 67 years old, presenting with irregular heartbeat and mild dyspnea. scheduled for monitoring before cardiac catheterization. And there, in the referring physician field, Captain David O'Brien, USAF Medical Command. Her son. Megan's hands went cold. Her vision narrowed. Not panic. She'd been trained better than to panic. This was what panic had looked like in Marja, a girl of 24 watching her hands shake while a boy died. What she felt now was something more controlled. Something with a structure and a timeline. Something she could manage if she simply accepted the mathematics of the situation. Colonel Vance would arrive in minutes. Colonel Vance was David's commanding officer, the man whose letter had saved David's life 3 years ago when the IED blast had shredded his left arm and the surgeons had wanted to amputate. Colonel Vance had written, "Captain O'Brien will be needed for strategic operations in theater. Recommend amputation prevention measures be prioritized." One typed letter. One commander's recommendation. And David had kept his arm. She locked her wrists. 4-count breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The box breathing technique they'd taught her in DevGru training. She'd used it between surgeries in field hospitals, used it when watching boys die while she ran out of supplies. She could use it in front of a patient monitor. By 9 o'clock, Colonel Vance was in bed 7. He was tall, even lying down, with the kind of shoulders that came from 50 years of military fitness. His wife sat beside him holding his hand, a woman in her early 60s with careful makeup and worry lines that had calcified into permanence. She kept asking if he was going to be okay. She kept asking if the doctors were certain. Megan heard her through the curtain while she organized the supply cart for the shift. The voice of Colonel Vance came next, pitched low and calm and shaped by decades of command. "They'll figure it out, Linda. We've got good people here." Megan kept her hand steady. She kept her breathing even. She moved through her preparation tasks with the kind of meticulous care that left no room for tremor. When Dr. Hargrove passed her in the hallway, he didn't acknowledge her. He simply walked past with his hospital badge clipped to his coat and his stethoscope draped like a status symbol, heading toward bed 7. The other nurses had shifted their focus now, excited about the Air Force admission. There was prestige in military patients. There was the possibility of interesting cases, complications that would keep the floor dynamic. Sarah was already reviewing his chart when Megan passed the station. She glanced up, then looked away. Megan noticed the look because it was different from the others. Not dismissive. Curious. Like Sarah was trying to solve something about her. By 10:30, Megan had completed vitals on all her assigned beds. She was reviewing the cardiac rhythm strips on Colonel Vance's monitor, sinus tachycardia with occasional premature atrial contractions, nothing alarming but worth investigation, when she noticed something subtle in the pattern. A slight irregularity in the PR interval. The kind of thing that most nurses would document and pass along to the physician. The kind of thing that a senior chief petty officer who had performed battlefield trauma assessments on 32 different patients under mortar fire recognized as a potential early indicator of something more serious. She pulled up the hospital system and found the order entry screen for diagnostic testing. Dr. Hargrove hadn't ordered an echocardiogram. He'd ordered basic blood work and scheduled a stress test for the afternoon. But the PR interval irregularity, combined with the patient's dyspnea and the slightly elevated troponin she could see in the chemistry panel, suggested something worth a closer look. Something that a stress test would be dangerous. Something that an echocardiogram would reveal. She made the decision in the space of 2 seconds. Not because she was supposed to. Because the alternative was letting a patient deteriorate when she had the knowledge to prevent it. Because David had sent this man to her hospital and that meant something that had no name in hospital protocol but had every name in the things she'd learned in wars. She picked up the phone and called the attending. "Dr. Patterson? This is Megan in cardiac ICU. Colonel Vance in 7, I'm seeing some PR changes I'd like you to consider. Wondering if we should get an echo before the stress test." The pause lasted 3 seconds. Not long. Just long enough for her to know he was deciding whether to listen. "You see something specific?" he asked. She pulled up the rhythm strip on her phone and transmitted it. PR interval variability. And his troponin is running 0.04. Could be nothing. But in combination with the dyspnea and his age, I'd rather rule out tamponade risk. Dr. Patterson looked at the strip. She could hear the small intake of breath that meant he'd seen it too. Good catch. Let me review his history. I'll get the echo ordered. The echo was authorized within 30 minutes. A technician came to the floor and wheeled the portable ultrasound into Bed 7's room. Colonel Vance was watching his wife's face the way men do when they're scared but determined not to show it. Linda kept asking questions. The technician didn't really answer them. Nobody answers questions about medical imaging until there's something confirmed enough to discuss. Megan hung supplies on the four-pole and checked the monitor one more time. She felt Colonel Vance watching her. Not with the awareness of recognizing someone. With the awareness of noticing someone competent. She kept her eyes on the equipment. She kept her voice neutral. How long have you been a nurse? Colonel Vance asked. 12 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. The truth was sealed in the answers. She gave him the civilian version instead. Just doing my job, sir. He didn't press. But his wife glanced up from her phone with new interest. You have good instincts, Linda said. The doctor said it was smart that you noticed something. Megan straightened the call bell within his reach. Just routine observation. The echo technician finished and left. The images would go to cardiology. The radiologist would interpret within the hour. And then something would either confirm her assessment or disprove it, and either way, she would have fulfilled the only obligation that mattered. She would have done what she knew how to do. She was back at the nurse's station reviewing her notes when Sarah approached. Not casually. With something deliberate in the set of her shoulders. That was a good call, Sarah said quietly. On the echo. Megan didn't look up from her documentation. Just checking for obvious things. Right, Sarah said. And then she walked back to where the others were gathered, and the silence that had been there that morning reformed, but subtly different. Like a wall with a door in it that might open later. Like maybe they were beginning to reconsider their calculations about her. Like maybe competence was a language they understood after all. But then Jennifer laughed a little too loud about something, and the conversation shifted away from Megan entirely, and she let it. She was good at letting things shift away. The fluorescent lights buzzed their 60-hertz song above the nurse's station, and Megan O'Brien filed her reports and waited for the echo results and kept her hands from trembling by sheer force of will, and nobody in Oak Creek Memorial knew that they were standing next to someone who had performed 47 emergency surgeries in a combat zone. Someone who had held lives together with hands steady enough to thread needles in conditions that would have broken civilians. Nobody knew. And that was exactly how she needed it to stay. But the air pressure in the room was starting to change. She could feel it. The kind of atmospheric shift that happened right before a storm. The storm arrived at 0800 during morning rounds. Dr. Hargrove swept into Colonel Vance's room with 3 residents trailing like satellites orbiting a dark star, his voice calibrated to carry through the open door and down the hallway. Megan stood at the bedside reviewing the monitor strip when he arrived. She didn't look up. Nurse O'Brien, perhaps you can explain to everyone why you ordered an echocardiogram on my patient without consulting me first. His tone was a blade wrapped in velvet, designed to draw blood without leaving marks. The resident shifted uncomfortably. The unit supervisor pretended to review the 4-pump. Megan's shoulders squared. One measured breath expanded her ribs. She kept her voice level, clinical. The patient exhibited muffled heart sounds and mild hypertension. The echo provides baseline cardiac function data. Did I ask for your clinical judgment? Hargrove stepped closer, invading her space like a predator testing whether prey would flee. I attended medical school, Nurse O'Brien. You attended a 2-year diploma program. There is a difference. He turned to Colonel Vance's wife, who sat clutching her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles had drained white. Mrs. Vance, I apologize that our nursing staff doesn't understand the chain of command. I will personally ensure this kind of insubordination doesn't happen again. The colonel's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but Hargrove was already pivoting back to Megan, his voice dropping into that particular register that made air in rooms go still. Your job is to follow orders, not play diagnostician with my patients. Bedpans and vitals, Nightingale. That's your scope. A single tear tracked down Megan's cheek. Not from anger. Not from humiliation. From the sheer mechanical release of pressure that had been building since 18 months ago when she'd walked into Oak Creek Memorial and decided that invisibility was survival. She wiped it away with the back of her hand before her face could betray anything else. When she spoke, her voice was steady as surgical steel. The echo showed pericardial effusion. The findings are documented in the chart. You're welcome to review it yourself, Doctor. Hargrove's face reddened in a way that suggested his blood pressure was climbing into dangerous territory. He stepped even closer, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all threat, all engine, nothing but noise. You're overstepping your credentials and your authority. This kind of behavior will be addressed. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, looked genuinely uncomfortable. The unit supervisor found something urgent to attend to at the monitors. Colonel Vance watched the entire exchange with the kind of attention that came from a lifetime of reading threats and hierarchies, understanding when someone was being systematically dismantled in front of witnesses. Hargrove left the room, but his voice remained, hanging in the air like contamination. 2 hours later, Megan carried her lunch tray into the break room. The 3 nurses who usually sat at the corner table, Maria, Patricia, and someone new named Jennifer, fell silent the moment she approached. They'd been laughing about something, a genuine sound, but it died as if someone had unplugged the speakers. They gathered their food without meeting her eyes and relocated to the far side of the room, leaving her alone under the flickering fluorescent tube that facilities never bothered to fix because broken overhead lights only illuminated the places where broken people Saturday. Megan ate methodically anyway. Hands folded. Sandwich consumed with the kind of mechanical precision that required no emotional investment. The whispers carried across the linoleum like wind through a canyon. Did you hear what she did? Directly contradicted him in front of residents. I heard she was trying to run the unit. Megan didn't look up. She'd learned a long time ago that reaction was its own kind of blood in the water. The strongest thing she could do was sit very still and chew, and breathe, and exist without needing anything from anyone. But that wasn't the worst part. At 14:30, when the shift change notices went up on the unit board, something else appeared alongside them. Dr. Hargrove had personally mounted a formal write-up with Megan's name printed in red marker that screamed like an alarm: disciplinary action, M. The Brian, insubordination and unauthorized diagnostic ordering, suspension pending administrative review. He positioned it at eye level where every staff member would see it during shift change. Where every patient family member would see it. Where it would become the first thing people associated with her name, the scarlet letter on the unit board that said, "This person cannot be trusted." The message was clear. Hargrove was signaling not just to Megan, but to everyone on the unit, challenge me and this happens to you. Megan's hands trembled for exactly 2 seconds in the break room bathroom. Alone. Door locked. Palms pressed flat against the cold sink. She forced the shaking to stop by sheer will, the same will that had kept her breathing when boys were screaming for mothers in Helmand Province. Then she washed her hands, applied fresh pressure to her composure, and returned to the unit. At 15:45, Dr. Hargrove returned to his office and left the door open. Deliberately open. The kind of open that wasn't about ventilation or casual accessibility, it was about acoustic strategy. Megan was finishing her paperwork at the nurse's station, exactly 30 feet away, when he picked up his phone and began making calls. His voice carried with the precision of someone who understood that volume was a weapon. "Yes, Board Member Richardson, I need your support on a personnel matter." Pause. Long enough that Megan could hear Richardson's response through the phone line's faint electronic whisper. A nurse with some concerning judgment patterns. Yes, the same facility. I've documented several instances of protocol violation. I'd appreciate you reviewing her file before the committee meets. Patient safety is our mutual concern, you understand. He hung up and dialed again immediately. Same performance. Same volume. Different board member. Dr. Hayes, this is Dr. Hargrove at Oak Creek Memorial. I need to escalate a personnel concern, insubordination and independent decision-making that circumvents physician authority. I'm initiating a full audit of her charts. I wanted to alert you before it becomes official. 3 more calls. 3 more times his voice reached across the hallway like tentacles wrapping around something small and trying to suffocate it. Each conversation calibrated to be audible. Each one calculated to poison the well before the machinery of institutional power even began to turn. When Megan finally left the unit at 18:30, her hands were shaking again, but her face was carved from stone. The security guard who usually nodded and said something about the rain, a man named Thomas who'd smiled at her birthday card in the break room 3 months ago, looked straight through her as she passed. The way a person looks through a space where nothing living exists anymore. That night, in his office at home, Dr. Hargrove began his final preparation. The kind of preparation that said he decided Megan O'Brien needed to be destroyed completely, thoroughly, in a way that would make sure no hospital in Norfolk would touch her again. He drafted emails to her nursing school references, each one a careful architecture of concern. I'm reaching out regarding a former graduate, Megan O'Brien, who's currently on staff here. I'm conducting a routine credentialing review and I'm wondering if you might recall any stability concerns during her training? There's been some clinical judgment issues that concern me as a supervising physician. I'd appreciate any historical context. The word stability was the nuclear option. Once a nurse was labeled unstable, it didn't matter if she could perform surgery in a hurricane. Once that word entered her permanent record, it became the filter through which everything else was viewed. He also made a phone call to a consultant named Dr. Marcus Chen, a former colleague from his residency days who owed him favors, big ones, the kind involving a divorce settlement that had needed creative accounting and Hargrove's very convenient testimony about the man's net worth. Marcus, I need you to do a peer review audit on one of my nurses. Chart review for a range of dates, last 18 months. Look for any deviation in documentation, any gaps in notation, anything that suggests she's operating outside her scope. I'll pay your standard rate. Actually, make it double. This needs to be thorough. What are you looking for specifically? Chen asked. Anything, Hargrove said. Everything. I just need ammunition. The line went quiet for a moment. Even Chen, even a man who'd been willing to commit perjury for his former colleague, seemed to register that this was different. This wasn't a dispute about clinical judgment. This was institutional homicide. I'll get started tomorrow, Chen said. Megan didn't know about the emails yet. Didn't know about the auditor. Didn't know that Hargrove had already calculated that formal termination through normal channels would take too long, so he decided instead to build a case so airtight that the hospital would terminate her with cause and it would stick in ways that made litigation impossible. 23 years of clinical excellence, of holding people together when they were falling apart, of being the person every patient asked for, it could all be painted as recklessness. As instability. As a nurse who thought she was smarter than the doctor. All it took was the right narrative, told to the right people, with enough institutional weight behind it. And Dr. Hargrove had spent his entire career becoming very good at telling narratives. Megan drove home in the rain, her hand steady on the wheel even though her chest felt like it was being compressed in a vice. The faded unit patch lay hidden in her jacket at home, sewn inside the lining where no one could see it. Where no one would ever know that the frightened woman being systematically dismantled in a Norfolk hospital had once worn the rank that put her above all of this. That she'd once commanded respect through sheer competence, through the kind of authority that didn't need a title because it lived in her hands and her judgment and her ability to make the right call when everything else was burning. She'd hidden all of that for 18 months because sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back. Sometimes it's disappearing so completely that no one even remembers you were ever there. But disappearing has a cost. She didn't go home. That was the first thing that should have told everyone something was wrong. A suspended nurse, officially terminated from duty pending review, should have stayed in her apartment with the lights off and her phone on silent. But at 0600, Megan O'Brien walked back through the employee entrance of Oak Creek Memorial like she'd never left, badge still in her pocket, muscle memory stronger than policy. The halls were quieter at this hour, skeleton crew, mostly residents and night shift nurses who'd learned not to ask questions. She moved through the corridors with the casual precision of someone who belonged there, which she did, even if the paperwork said otherwise. In the break room, she pulled on fresh scrubs from her locker. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even saw her. By 0800, she was reviewing charts at a station 2 floors away from Dr. Hargrove's rounds, monitoring patients she wasn't technically allowed to touch, taking vitals on a man in 412 whose blood pressure had been creeping upward all week and whose wife had specifically requested her before the official write-up made that request impossible. The irony wasn't lost on Megan. She'd spent 18 months learning how to be invisible, how to work the margins, how to help without being noticed. Now that invisibility was her only superpower left. Colonel Bradley Vance was in room 304, stable on telemetry, his EKG showing the sinus rhythm she'd documented in the echo report that had somehow become evidence against her. She'd checked on him at 1600, 1900, 2200, never in Hargrove's sight, always when the rounds were happening on other units. The colonel seemed to be resting well. His wife had gone home around 2100, kissing his forehead with the kind of gentleness that came from decades of marriage, from knowing you might not get every moment. Megan had watched from the doorway without being seen, thinking of her own son, David, and whether he knew where his commanding officer was, and whether any of this mattered in the grand architecture of things that nobody would ever explain to her. At 0230, Colonel Vance's monitor screamed. Not a routine arrhythmia alarm, not a false lead. The sound that meant a human being was dying in real time, and everyone on the unit knew it. Megan was in his room in 4 seconds. She didn't run. She walked. But her hand was already checking his carotid pulse before her eyes registered the grey-lipped face, the way his skin had gone the color of old concrete. His jugular veins were distended like cords, pushing up from his neck with the pressure of something trapped inside the pericardium. Blood that should have been circulating was collecting around his heart like water in a reservoir with no overflow valve. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis was there in the physical exam, written in physiology that couldn't lie. She found his blood pressure, 68/44. Dropping. The monitor showed a faint electrical activity on the screen, electromechanical dissociation, when the heart's electrical system was still firing but the mechanical action was compromised by the fluid compressing the chambers. He was dying from the inside out, and he had maybe 8 to 10 minutes of perfusion left before his brain started dying with him. Dr. Hargrove arrived in his white coat, still buttoning the cuffs, his face cycling through expressions, alarm, then annoyance at being called. He looked at the monitor, then at Megan, and his jaw tightened. He keyed the intercom without touching the patient. Cardiothoracic consult to the ICU. Stat! The casual tone of someone ordering room service. Then he turned to the resident who'd paged him. We'll need the unit ready for emergency transfer. Call OR, tell them we're looking at a possible pericardial window procedure. Megan's voice dropped into the tone she'd sworn she'd buried with her commission. Not loud. Quieter, actually. The voice that had once directed a 4-man trauma team in a field hospital with the building shaking from artillery rounds impacting 2 blocks away. Cardiothoracic is 40 minutes out. He won't last 8. Hargrove's head snapped toward her. You're suspended, Ms. O'Brien. You're not even supposed to be. His pressure is 68/44 and dropping. Distended JVD. Muffled heart sounds. He's in tamponade. Megan was already moving, hands reaching for the ultrasound machine in the corner of the room, the same machine she'd used to save his life once before, only he didn't know that part yet. I can do bedside pericardiocentesis in 2 minutes. He survives. We wait for cardiothoracic, he arrests. The resident stared at both of them, a kid maybe 2 years out of medical school, caught in the gravity well between a suspended nurse and an attending physician who controlled his recommendation letters. Hargrove smiled. It was a terrible smile. "You're going to perform a pericardiocentesis? A procedure that requires physician oversight, performed by a nurse who's currently under investigation for exactly this kind of unauthorized. Step back or he dies." It wasn't a request. The way she said it made the monitor seem louder in the silence that followed, that single flat statement carrying the weight of 2 decades of command authority. Megan had positioned the ultrasound probe, was already scanning the subxiphoid window, the screen blooming with the image of his heart, the right atrium compressed from outside like a fist closing on a piece of fruit, the dark anechoic stripe of pericardial effusion surrounding the ventricles like the space between worlds. 200 cc of blood where there should have been none. Maybe more. The colonel's heart was drowning inside his chest. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed pericardiocentesis in a field hospital with the building shaking, with incoming rounds close enough that dust filtered down from the ceiling beams. 19-year-olds bleeding out in the dirt, calling for mothers who would never hear them again. She'd done this procedure on kids whose names she'd never learned, whose faces she still saw in the blur between sleep and waking. Drawn up the lidocaine, 1% with epinephrine for hemostasis. Identified the needle angle, 30 degrees toward the left shoulder. The 18-gauge needle was long enough to reach the pericardial sac, sharp enough to part the visceral membrane without dragging tissue. Colonel Vance's blood pressure ticked down, 64/40ths. The monitor beeped in a rhythm that was becoming increasingly erratic. Megan infiltrated the lidocaine at the insertion site below the xiphoid process, felt the needle penetrate skin, subcutaneous tissue, the fibrous pericardium. Muscle memory. The kind of memory that lived in hands instead of the conscious mind. The kind that couldn't be suspended or investigated or made invisible by paperwork. Hargrove actually grabbed her shoulder. She shrugged him off without looking, her focus absolute as a laser-guided missile. The needle advanced, ultrasound confirming the tip crossing into the pericardial space, the dark fluid opening up around the needle like water parting for a stone. She aspirated. The syringe filled with dark blood, not bright arterial blood, but the deep maroon of venous pooling. 120 cc in the first draw. Maybe more. As the fluid drained from the pericardium, the pressure around the colonel's heart released like a fist unclenching. His blood pressure climbed, 78/50 seconds, then 84/58ths. The monitor showed the electrical activity sharpen, the waveforms becoming more defined. Color returned to his face, not the grey-lipped death mask, but the pink of actual perfusion, actual oxygen reaching actual tissue. Megan withdrew the needle, applied pressure to the insertion site with a 4x4 gauze, and finally allowed herself one controlled breath. In and out. Diaphragm expanding. The crisis was past. The colonel would live. He'd live because she'd stepped into a memory she'd spent 18 months trying to bury, and muscle memory had taken over like muscle memory did, indifferent to whether she wanted it to or not. But that wasn't the worst part. That was the moment the ICU double doors exploded inward like they'd been hit by a breaching charge. A wild-eyed man in street clothes burst through the threshold, screaming in a language Megan recognized before she could process recognition. Pashto. Accented English underneath it. Colonel Vance. Colonel Vance. The voice of someone whose entire world had narrowed to a single target, to a single man in a hospital bed. The night security guard moved on instinct. The attacker produced something from his jacket, a folding blade that snapped open with a metallic click that shot Megan's heart rate to 140, that tunneled her vision, that brought every combat response she'd carefully compartmentalized back online like a radio frequency suddenly tuning into range. The knife caught the security guard across the forearm. He stumbled backward, blood already visible in the fluorescent light. The attacker lunged deeper into the room, toward Colonel Vance's bed, toward the man who lay vulnerable and sedated and entirely defenseless. Megan stepped between them. Not thinking. Not planning. Muscle memory and training overrode 18 months of invisible civilian camouflage. The knife arced toward her center mass. She felt the cold bite of steel across her ribs, the familiar sensation that her body had learned to hate and her hands had learned to survive. The blade sliced through scrubs, through skin, a 6-inch laceration that burned hot and immediate. Blood soaked through her shirt, spreading like spilled wine across white linen. She pressed her palm to the wound automatically. Pressure, always pressure. Pressure was the first rule of hemorrhage control. Her other hand moved on its own, catching the attacker's wrist, rotating his arm into a joint lock that was muscle memory from a different life, a different version of herself. The lock drove him to his knees. Security tackled him the rest of the way down. Megan stood over Colonel Vance's bed with her hand clamped to her ribs, blood spreading across her scrubs in a widening stain. Her voice sounded distant. "Call trauma surgery. Tell them laceration to the left lateral chest wall, approximately 6 inches, unknown depth. Possible intercostal involvement." The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Hargrove stood in the doorway with his mouth open like a door on rusted hinges. For once, for the very first time, no words came out. The needle went in beneath the xiphoid process with the precision of muscle memory etched deeper than conscious thought, the same angle, the same pressure, the same absolute certainty that lives depended on getting this exactly right. Megan's hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd performed this procedure in a field hospital in Helmand Province while mortar rounds hammered the compound walls, someone who'd learned that hesitation kills faster than infection ever could. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid through skin and fascia and pericardium with barely any resistance. She could feel Colonel Vance's heartbeat through the needle, a desperate, fluttering thing like a bird trapped in a cage. The syringe filled. Dark red blood. 100 cubic centimeters. The pressure that had been choking his heart released like a valve opening. 120 cubic centimeters. His blood pressure monitor beeped, the numbers climbing. 72. 80. 85. Sinus rhythm returned, steady and strong, and Megan allowed herself one full breath, the first breath she'd taken since the monitor alarm screamed him toward death. Colonel Vance's color changed from gray to pink. His eyes flickered open. His wife's hand found his shoulder. The ICU nurses who'd been frozen in the corner began moving again, the spell of immediate death broken by the simple act of a woman who knew how to pull people back from the edge. But that wasn't the worst part. The ICU doors burst open with violence. A man stood in the frame, wild eyes, dark beard, clothes that hadn't seen a washing machine in days. He screamed Colonel Vance's name in a voice that held 3 years of hunting compressed into a single moment. Security moved immediately, 2 officers stepping forward with hands raised in the universal language of de-escalation. The man's arm came up. Metal caught the fluorescent light. The knife appeared like a magic trick, like it had always been there waiting for this exact second. He slashed at the nearest security guard, and the sound of the blade cutting air was almost musical, a whisper that said everything about the sharpness, about the intent. The guard stumbled backward, his uniform torn but not his skin. Not yet. The man moved toward the bed. Toward Colonel Vance. Toward the woman who'd just finished saving his life. Megan stepped between them before her brain caught up with her body. The blade came in low, aimed at her ribs, and she felt it the way you feel cold water when you first enter the ocean, a shock, a stealing of breath, a moment of absolute clarity when time stops. The knife bit across her ribs like ice and fire combined, a burning line of damage beneath her borrowed scrubs. Her left hand came up in a combat lock she hadn't used in 14 years, a wrist takedown that came from muscle memory so deep it lived in her bones. Her thumb found the pressure point on his inner wrist. She didn't twist hard. She didn't need to. The knife fell to the linoleum floor with a sound like a dropped instrument tray. The man's arm came with it, his body following the physics of leverage and gravity and a technique taught to Navy SEALs in a gymnasium in San Diego that had been classified until she performed it in public in front of 17 witnesses. 2 security officers had him on the ground before her brain fully registered that she'd moved. She stood there in the space between the bed and the attacker, her hand pressed against her side, her borrowed scrubs already darkening with blood that felt warm and cold at the same time. Colonel Vance stared up at her from his bed. His wife's mouth was open. The ICU staff had gone completely still. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway with his mouth open like a door on rusted hinges. For once, for the very first time, no words came out. The ER physician on call, not Hargrove, arrived within 4 minutes. His name was Dr. Chen, and he was the kind of competent that came from 8 years of watching people bleed and learning not to panic. He didn't ask questions. He didn't lecture. He examined the wound, determined that the blade had entered at an oblique angle that minimized organ damage, that she'd apparently turned her body slightly at the moment of impact in a way that suggested advanced trauma knowledge, and that she needed 14 stitches and a tetanus update but no hospital admission if she refused it. She refused it. While Chen irrigated the wound with sterile saline and the sting made her jaw clench, she kept her eyes on Colonel Vance. His eyes never left her face. He looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle, like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite see but could absolutely feel. By 0600, the sun came up grey over Norfolk and Megan sat in a plastic chair outside the ICU wearing Chen's borrowed scrubs, her own clothes bagged as evidence, while 2 Norfolk police detectives took her statement about the attacker. She gave them what they needed, the moment he came through the doors, the blade, the fact that she'd disarmed him using what she described as self-defense training. She didn't mention Marja. She didn't mention 14 years in naval special warfare. She didn't mention the 7-week course at Fort Bragg where they taught you exactly how to take a knife away from someone who wanted to kill you. The attacker was sedated in the secure psychiatric ward, identity unknown, waiting for federal questioning. Colonel Vance was stable, transferred to cardiac step-down. By 0800, the hospital administrator arrived. Dr. Marcus Webb had the kind of face that smiled easily and meant nothing, a residency partner of Hargrove's, a golf buddy, a man whose loyalty had been purchased in increments of favor and covered up mistakes. He called Megan into the conference room where Hargrove sat with a legal pad covered in notes that looked like an indictment. Webb's voice was formal, rehearsed, the way people sound when they're reading a script someone else wrote. Ms. O'Brien, effective immediately, your employment at Oak Creek Memorial is terminated for cause. You violated suspension orders by entering this facility. You practice medicine outside your scope of licensure. Your unauthorized presence directly provoked a violent incident that endangered staff and patients. Megan sat with her hands folded on the table. Her side burned where the stitches pulled. She said nothing. The silence in the room felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Hargrove leaned forward, and there was something almost triumphant in his expression, the look of a man who'd finally gotten what he wanted. We've also contacted the Virginia Board of Nursing regarding your pattern of overreach and disregard for medical hierarchy. You'll be fortunate to work in healthcare again. Webb slid termination papers across the table. Megan didn't pick them up. She just looked at them the way you look at something that doesn't belong to you. We'll need your badge, locker contents, and any hospital property immediately, Webb said. By 0900, Hargrove had activated his full network like a man mobilizing troops. He called the nursing schools where Megan had completed her civilian certification, leaving detailed voicemail messages about concerning behavioral patterns and questions about her background that she's refused to address. He brought in Dr. Raymond Chase, a risk management specialist who owed Hargrove for a covered-up malpractice incident 3 years prior, the kind of debt that meant Chase would find violations even if he had to manufacture them like evidence in a courtroom lie. Hargrove personally visited 3 board members' offices, building the narrative with the precision of someone who understood institutional power, a dangerous rogue nurse with a mysterious past, possible substance abuse issues, definitely psychological instability. By noon, Megan stood at a bus stop 3 blocks from Oak Creek Memorial, standing in the cold drizzle that always came off the Norfolk harbor in November. The kind of rain that felt like the city was crying. She held a cardboard box going soft in her hands. Inside, her cracked World's Okayest nurse mug with the handle barely attached, a dying succulent she'd kept on the break room windowsill for 18 months, a photo in a cheap wooden frame showing the triangle-folded American flag from her husband's funeral. He'd been killed in Fallujah 11 years ago, before David was old enough to remember him. Before she'd walked away from everything. The stitches in her side pulled with each breath she took. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, "David's coming home on leave next week. Can't wait for you to finally meet his CO, Colonel Vance says amazing things about him." Megan closed her eyes and let the rain fall on her face. She thought about the Colonel's expression as the tamponade released, that moment of relief when his heart could finally beat without being crushed. She thought about stepping between him and the blade. She thought about the fact that he'd been trying to thank her for something she'd done 14 years ago, in a place she'd spent half a decade trying to forget. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. A detective. The attacker was awake, and he was asking for her. He was asking for her by description, like he'd been looking for her for a very long time. By dawn, everything had fractured. The administrator's office called at 0600, not to ask questions, but to deliver the decision. Megan sat across from Patricia Webb, whose jaw was set the way it got when she'd already taken Hargrove's side, and the words came in the tone of someone reading from a script, practicing outside your scope of practice. Provoking a violent incident. Interfering with physician's orders. The formal termination letter was printed on hospital letterhead, her name at the top in bold. Hargrove had moved fast. He'd called 3 board members from his office with the door open so she could hear, she understood that now, the performance of it all. He'd contacted her nursing school references at 0200. He'd brought in an outside consultant at 0330 to review every single chart she'd touched in 18 months. By 0600, the board had voted. She'd been gone for 3 hours total, stabbed, stitched, fired, thrown away like contaminated waste. The rain fell hard when she walked out with the cardboard box. Her world in cardboard. The world's okayest nurse mug with its crack down the side was wrapped in newspaper, rattling against a dying succulent she'd kept alive for 14 months, brown leaves, one stubborn green shoot. The photo of her husband's funeral flag lay flat on the bottom, protected. That was the thing about military funerals, they gave you the flag in a triangle, made it official. Gone meant gone. She stood under the awning at the bus stop on Military Highway, watching the water stream off the concrete, soaking into everything. Her scrubs were still damp with blood, her blood, carefully patched with sutures she'd done herself in the bathroom because she couldn't let them do it, couldn't let them see where the knife had gone, how deep it was, how her ribs had cracked against the blade's angle. The phone rang at 0830. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. The voice was professional, female, controlled. "This is Detective Sarah Chen, Norfolk PD. I'm calling because the individual detained after the incident at Oak Creek Memorial is regaining consciousness. He's been asking for someone." Megan's chest tightened. "What do you mean, asking?" "He's sedated, then lucid, then sedated again, but when he comes around, he's asking for a woman. He can't quite remember the name, but he keeps saying something in another language, Pashto, we think, and then in broken English, the medic with the scars on her hands." The rain hammered harder. Megan looked at her hands. Yes, there they were, the old surgical scars from Marja running across her knuckles, the stories written in calcium deposits where bones had healed wrong. She'd worn gloves for 18 months. One moment of urgency, one moment of saving someone's life, and she'd forgotten to cover them. "He also said something else," Chen continued. "He said something about bombs. About his brother. He's talking about a compound. He's talking about you." Megan's hand went to her ribs. The wound throbbed like a second heartbeat. 3 stitches deep. The knife had caught between 2 ribs. If she'd moved 6 inches either direction, they'd be shipping her back to a flag-folded ceremony. She should have been on that bus. Should have ridden it to the 7-Eleven, bought cheap coffee, found a motel, reinvented herself again. She was good at that, it was the staying that was impossible. Instead, at 13:40, Megan walked back through the glass doors of Oak Creek Memorial. The security guard, the same one who'd handed her the cardboard box at 0430, looked up from his desk. His name was Marcus. She'd never spoken to him before. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Soldiers recognized soldiers, even in polyester uniforms and a radio clipped to a belt. She wasn't in scrubs anymore. She was in jeans and a hoodie, and she was walking toward the ICU like she still belonged there. "Chief," Marcus called out. She stopped. That was rank. He'd called her rank when he'd never known it. "You back for something?" It wasn't a question. He could see it in her face, the purpose, the decision. The way someone carries themselves when the mission isn't finished. "Patient in sedation," Megan said. "Needs to speak to me." Marcus nodded once. Slow, deliberate. He picked up his radio, clicked twice, the universal signal for acknowledgement, and turned back to his desk. Didn't watch her walk past. Didn't ask questions. The ICU was the same symphony of beeping it had always been. O2 monitors ticking off percentages, ventilators whooshing steady breath, the hum of pharmaceutical drips counting down in microliter increments. But something had changed in the room where the attacker lay restrained, not hostile restraints, but soft ones. Medical holds. Wrist cuffs padded with trauma-friendly material. He was asleep, his face relaxed in the way only sedation allows, and Megan could see it clearly now, the way his jaw set, the angle of his eyes, the structure of his face. Young. Maybe 30. Maybe younger if he'd seen combat. She knew that look, the look of someone whose eyes had seen things that aged them from the inside out. Detective Chen was waiting in the hallway. Indian American, early 40s, the kind of composure that meant she'd worked homicide before she worked attempted murders in hospitals. "You're the medic," Chen said. "Not a question." "I'm the nurse," Megan corrected. But her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't deliberate. It was reflex. He's been saying things in his sleep. Pashto phrases, medical terms in English that don't belong in a civilian's vocabulary. He keeps calling out for someone. The lady with the rifle is what he says in English. The lady who carried the gun and the medicine bag both. Chen pulled up a chair, gestured for Megan to sit. Megan remained standing. "He may cooperate if he sees you. He may respond to seeing a familiar face, if you are that face." "Are you that face?" Megan didn't answer. She looked through the glass partition at the man asleep in the bed, the restraints gentle against his wrists, and she felt something inside her shift. Years of careful silence. Years of building a different person, a quieter one, a smaller one. All of it about to crack like that mug. "I can't promise anything," Megan said. "But I'll sit with him. When he wakes." Chen stood. "That's all I'm asking. Sometimes people need to see a face from home before they can make sense of what they've done here." She handed Megan a business card. 2 phone numbers. "If he says anything about the attack, about motivations, anything relevant to the investigation, call me." "But Chief," and there was something knowing in her eyes, "I don't think this was random, was it?" Megan took the card. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She sat beside the bed for 3 hours. The man's monitors beeped their steady rhythm. His blood pressure was stable. His O2 sat holding at 96. The sedation was light enough that she could watch the REM flutter behind his eyelids, could see the shapes of dreams moving under the surface. She'd done this before, combat medic night watch, sitting beside men who might wake up screaming, who might wake up different. The trick was to be present but still. Quiet but ready. A stone that happened to be human. Around 1600, his eyes opened. Slow, confused, the way sedation release always is, like swimming up from underwater and finding the water had turned into air. His eyes found the ceiling first, then the fall line, then the monitor, then her. The moment was so precise she could have marked it, the second recognition hit. His jaw opened. His hands pulled against the restraints, once, hard enough that the alarm on the monitor spiked. Megan stood. One hand raised, palm out. Not aggressive. The universal signal for calm. For truce. "I'm here," she said quietly. "You're safe. Breathe." She used the command voice, not loud, but the kind of voice that cuts through panic because it carries authority. The kind of voice that had once told men to hold pressure on their wounds, to stay with her, to breathe, breathe, just breathe, because she was here and she wouldn't let them die. His eyes flooded. Not tears, something deeper. Recognition so profound his entire body shook. "The medic," he whispered. "From the compound. From Marja. The lady with the... I was trying to kill him. I was trying to kill him because..." His voice broke. "Because my brother was in the compound. The Air Force said he was a target, but he wasn't. He was just in the wrong place and your bombs came and he burned, and I've been looking for you for 15 years and yesterday I saw him walk into the hospital and I knew he was military and you were with him and I just wanted to..." He stopped, gasping. Megan didn't move. She didn't look away. She let him see her face, the same face that had knelt beside his brother in the dust, that had done the math between what could be saved and what couldn't, that had made the choice he'd been living with for 15 years. "I remember your brother," Megan said. Her voice was steady. "Hassan. He helped us. He told us where the cell phones were transmitting, helped us find the IED that would have killed 4 of my men." She paused. "I held him when the mortar came. I didn't let him alone. That matters. The man, his name was Mirza, the chart said so, but she was already calling him by his brother's name in her head, closed his eyes. The restraints had gone slack. His face was the color of old paper. He died hating me. I wasn't there. I was in Sanjin, in some cell, and he was in that compound because he was waiting for me to come home and I never did and the Americans came in." His last words, Megan said quietly, were in Pashto. "He said them to me. He said, 'Tell my brother I forgive him.' That was all. 'Tell my brother I forgive him.'" She had never told anyone this. She'd carried it for 15 years like a secret stone. He knew. Somehow he knew you would blame yourself, and he forgave you first. The room held only the sound of the ventilator for the neighboring patient, the beep of monitors keeping the rhythm of the living. Mirza's hands relaxed completely. His eyes stayed closed. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I wanted to die. I wanted to finally stop." "I know," Megan said. She pulled the chair close and sat beside him. Not reaching out, not touching, but present. "But you're going to live. You're going to heal. And you're going to find a different way forward because your brother spent his last moments making peace, and you're going to honor that by doing the same." Mirza opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "What's your name?" "Your real name." For 14 years, she'd been Megan O'Brien, RN. Simple. Quiet. Safe. But that woman was standing in a bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box, and this woman, the one sitting beside the bed, was someone else entirely. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien," she said. U.S. Navy. Naval Special Warfare. Each title was a breath. Each rank was a stone settling back into place. "And I'm going to help you figure out what comes next, because that's what the medics do. We save the ones we can." Detective Chen got her statement 2 hours later. Mirza's statement followed. The pieces of what happened, not justice exactly, but clarity, began to assemble. Megan walked out of Oak Creek Memorial at 1840, and this time she didn't take the bus. She called David. "Mom." His voice cracked on a single syllable. "Mom, where are you?" "Norfolk," she said. "Coming home." Like this, if you subscribe and hit that notification bell, you'll get alerts whenever we post a new story. Heroes like Megan are everywhere, just waiting for someone to see them. So hit that subscribe button, like this video, and leave a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were? What would you have done in Megan's position? And don't forget to check out our other videos, they're full of stories about the quiet warriors among us. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.